Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. I'm Sophia, your host. Are you one of those Muslims who rarely reads the Quran? Or perhaps you read it often but aren't convinced it's making enough of an impact on you? Do you want to develop a stronger relationship with the Quran? I am honored to speak with Sheikh Ahmed Saad. He is the founder and director of the UK-based Ihsan Institute for Arabic and Islamic Sciences. Not only did he complete his graduate studies at Al-Azhar University, he also studied at the hands of many scholars in Egypt, and he obtained licenses to teach many religious subjects, including the Quran. Sheikh Ahmed will share his advice on how best to enhance our own spiritual connection with the Quran. Sheikh Ahmed, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
Thank you.
Now, many Muslims read the Quran daily in their prayers, the daily prayers, but sometimes they don't necessarily have that connection to the Quran that they might want to have. What is your advice to a Muslim in that case?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, the gracious, the most merciful. I believe that the biggest problem with Muslims in the Quran is the problem of content. If you read a text that is written in another language, you won't be able to connect with it, because part and parcel of our connection with anything that we read is one, loving it, two, being able to understand it. That's why I believe that the most important advice that I can give to a Muslim to read the Quran before they read the Quran is to read the translation of the Quran. If the Quran is not in your language and you haven't studied Arabic to a level that is enabling you to appreciate the Quran, it is better for you before you read it, before you read the Arabic text, is to read the translation and try to live the modes of the Quran. I used to do some kind of practice before I get my students involved in listening to the Quran. I would first explain to them what they are going to listen to. So I basically make them live in the mode of the Quran, visualize. I ask them to visualize. And then ask them to read the ayat, to read the verses of the Quran, and then listen to it. One of the early scholars of Islam, a man called Al-Harith Al-Muhasabi, wrote a book called At-Tawahhum, Imagination or Visualization. Basically, that book was based on the idea of visualizing that you are in a grave. What will happen to you if you are in the grave? What will you be going through? What types of questions? The feelings of loneliness. And by creating this atmosphere, he brings what we can call the moral lessons that we can benefit from being in the grave. What will happen on the Day of Judgment? What will happen to you if you are standing in front of God and He's reckoning you and He's asking you questions? By visualizing something like that, it brings to the person some kind of awe and fear of God, some kind of righteousness. If nowadays, even in cinema, they make people feel and visualize the whole idea of virtual realities. Work on that, working on bringing the mind into a scenario. So unless we are able to do this, we move ourselves to the Quran, to the context and the scenarios of the Quran, we will not be able to connect with it properly.
Do you think this is also important for Arabs? I noticed you mentioned non-Arabs, but do Arabs also have to go through this visualization process?
Definitely, because one thing we need to understand is the language Arabs speak today is far down from the language, the classical and the proper Arabic language. Arabs at the time of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, they were at a level, not all of them by the way, some of them were at the level of appreciating the Quran. Some were unable to. When a man listened to the Quran recited by the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, his direct response was that it is so sweet and it is so great and it is so fruitful and it's so deep, and this cannot be the words of jinn or men. So that was the direct response of one person. The direct response of another person was, well, I believe what you're saying. So basically shifting from not believing in the Prophet to believing in the Prophet just by listening to the Quran. Some other people listened to the Quran and they could not understand what it is hinting at. So we understand that at those days there were levels of understandings as well. However, the kind of an average Arab would speak very eloquent and very beautiful language in those days. Now, with the lack of education or with the decline in the level of Arabic, we can see that the peoples, even the Arabs of today, their connection with the Quran has dwindled because of the problem, the weakness of their language. In fact, I say, if we imagine a poet who lived 500 years ago, only 500 years ago, to come back from his grave and speak the language that he spoke in those days, many people nowadays will not understand him.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, the Quran speaks about people's hearts trembling and skin crawling. How do we get to that stage where we experience the Quran and the message of God in that way?
You see, the Quran actually speaks to three things in us. It speaks to our minds, and it speaks to our hearts, and it speaks to our souls. And each of these levels require a specific way of addressing. When it speaks to the mind, it speaks to the mind in a very intellectual discourse, in a very intellectual way. Like, look at the heavens, reflect upon this, reflect upon that. It has a very beautiful discourse. And in fact, one of the scholars of the early days, Yemeni scholar, Ibn al-Wazir, wrote a book called ترجيح أساليب القرآن على أساليب اليونان, like giving preference to the Quranic way of argumentation over the Greek way of argumentation. Because Greek philosophers were amazing in the way they argued and they philosophized things. So he's basically looked at this and looked at the Quranic way and analyzed, and he realized that the Quranic way is far more better, right? So the Quran, when it speaks to the mind, it speaks to the mind by putting principles that are very rational and very understandable to the mind. When it speaks to the heart, it speaks to the heart with emotions, right? And that's why we need to receive what is being delivered to the heart with the heart. How do we do that? By creating an atmosphere in which the heart is going to be present. Well, if you are listening to, if you're speaking to a friend or something, and he's occupied with something else, he will not understand what you're talking to them about, isn't it? You might be, if someone is busy, or someone is worried, or someone is concerned, and he's just focused and consumed completely in what he's thinking of, and you're just telling them a story, they will not understand what you're talking about. They might not even be able to hear you, isn't it? So when we come to the Quran gives us the key word. وَأَنصِتُوا وَإِذَا قُرِئَ الْقُرْآنُ فَاسْتَمِعُوا لَهُ وَأَنصِتُوا. When the Quran is recited, listen, and then attentively listen. So there are two different levels here. فَاسْتَمِعُوا, listen, and then attentively listen. When you listen to something, it should attract you at the beginning, right? When you hear some noise, or you hear some music, or you hear something that is sweet, it attracts your attention at the beginning, but then you listen attentively. As if the Quran says, and actually the rest of the verse is, لَعَلَّكُمْ تُرْحَمُونَ, so that you will be showered with mercy. It means that you will not be showered with mercy until you are attentively listening. So you got to be attracted, and then attentively listen in order to get what you want. So we got to have our hearts present. How is that? Cut all the things that occupy us from the Quran. When we recite, we try to have wudu, to have ablution, to be in a state of purity, to try to face the Qibla, face the direction of prayer, sit properly, prepare, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, prepare ourselves intellectually, prepare ourselves content-wise. And when we listen to the Quran, or when we're reciting the Quran, we're reciting with our eyes, we're reflecting with our minds, and we are interacting with our hearts. And we make sure that we do this, we do it in a pure context. The place is perfumed, smells nice, making this atmosphere. It's just like, when someone wants to focus with his studies, you can't just like be messy in your study room. It will affect the quality of your studies. Same thing, you can't be messy and occupied in your Quranic studies when you are studying the Quran, when you're reading the message of God. If you're speaking to a king, or to a queen, or to a great person, you will be completely attentive, because you know that you are in the presence of an important person. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, said, if you want to speak to God, you recite his words. So if we try to make or to create this atmosphere, I believe the heart will be present, and if the heart is present, it will be able to kind of register with the Quran. It will be able to encapsulate the message that is being sent. Same thing will happen with the soul as well.
Tell us about someone who's not Muslim. How can they approach the Quran and benefit from it?
Well, the Quran actually itself says that it has been revealed as a manifestation for everything and as guidance and mercy to the believers. تِبْيَانًا لِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ وَهُدًى وَرَحْمَةً لقوم يؤمنون. So in fact, the Quran addresses people at two different levels. Those who accept it as a divine book, and those who take it as a methodology or a way that they can live, or you can say a value system book, a book that has got a lot of good values and things that people can live up to. For the believers who accept it as a divine book, they have duties. Beside living up to the values that are instilled in them by the Quran, they have other duties, like they have to be pure before touching the Quran. They can recite the Quran in their salah and in their prayer. There are certain things they can do with the Quran. There are certain things that they cannot do with the Quran. There are legislation, tashri', like jurisprudence rulings that are inculcated in the Quran that they have to abide by. But for a non-Muslim, there is huge values in the Quran that they can adopt and embrace, even if they don't accept the Quran as a divine book. These values include not being judgmental, equality, respect, fairness, avoiding any form of injustice, the right of every person to choose his faith or to leave his faith, the right of every person to speak the truth, the right of every person to be treated fairly. All these rights and all these responsibilities set out by the Quran. The Quran actually speaks of what we call al-hayah al-tayyiba, good life. And what is a good life? In a prayer that we recite 17 times a day, known as Surah Al-Fatiha, the opening chapter, we ask Allah to give us four things. One, to enable us to recognize the truth, and two, to enable us to adopt it, and three, to enable us to know what is a good life, and four, to enable us to adopt it. So we say, praise is due to Allah, Lord of the worlds. That's the truth, right? And then we say, you alone we worship, and you alone we turn to for help. That's adopting the truth. And then we say, guide us to the straight path. That's living a good life. And then we say, the path of those whom you have favored, not those who have incurred your wrath, nor those who have gone astray. So basically, how can we stay away? How can we adopt value? How can we live a good life? The Quran speaks about this good life, and it doesn't say it has to be only Muslims who live it. Whoever wants to lead a good life, there are levels of good life. They can take that from the Quran, definitely, even if they don't believe it.
We appreciate you joining us, Sheikh Ahmed Saad.
Thank you.
We'll take a break. When we return, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, we'll be looking at a book written on that subject.